Very proud to present panelists Dr. Chris Frizzell and Dr. Chad Hansen, and we're really honored to have them with us here today, and very much appreciate that they've traveled very long distances to share their expertise and experience and perspectives with us. And both scientists have published extensively in their respective fields and have decades of professional experience. Dr. Frizzell's work focuses on water quality in fish, and Dr. Hansen's work specializes in fire ecology and wildlife. And to tell you a little bit more about each of them, and I will say that it was very hard to condense the bios down. They've just, the work experience and publishing experience was tremendous, and so I had quite a task trying to fit this into small paragraphs. So Dr. Chris Frizzell is a consulting research ecologist and freshwater conservation biologist, and he's an affiliate research professor at the Flathead Lake Biological Station at the University of Montana. And his research publications include more than 30 scientific papers and numerous other publications. His research interest focuses on land aquatic ecosystem linkages, conservation biology of fishes and freshwater biota, cumulative impacts of natural processes and human activities on stream habitats, aquatic ecosystem conservation and restoration strategies, and restoration and recovery planning and design for freshwater ecosystems and species. He has a PhD and an MS in fishery science from Oregon State University, and he has also worked at OSU as a research assistant professor with the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. And Dr. Chad Hansen is a research ecologist, and so this is Dr. Frizzell, and Dr. Chad Hansen sitting over there. And Dr. Chad Hansen is a research ecologist with the John Muir Project of the Earth Island Institute, and that is in Big Bear City, California, and he has a PhD in ecology from the University of California at Davis, with a research focus on fire ecology in conifer forest ecosystems. And he is the author, co-editor and co-author of the 2015 book, The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. And studies published by Hansen cover topics such as habitat selection of rare wildlife species associated with habitat created by high severity fire, post-fire conifer response and adaptations, fire history, and current fire patterns. And so we thank you both for being here and welcome. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to let Dr. Frizzell get started.
Okay, this is going to be a fairly general presentation, but it may give you hopefully a little more coherent view of where I'm coming from on questions of how we manage riparian forests, particularly with regard to an interest in fire ecology and fire management. In the Pacific Northwest, I've over the last several years, I've had a string of projects related to basically doing scientific synthesis on this question and organizing a scientific panel of, I think we had 12 or 13 different scientists with different disciplinary emphases working together to prepare a literature review paper, which I'm working on right now. Some of the work's focused on the Northwest Forest Plan, but this presentation is more generally looking at fitting with regard to fire and fuels, including in interior areas. So I think I'm going to skip through some of these pretty fast since we're short on time, and that one is obviously skippable. Slow response time there. So as Chad discussed a bit this morning, we have a long list of now, one of the things that's changed in the literature in the last 15 years particularly strongly is recognize a set of benefits that are associated with wildfire, and often the benefits are most strongly expressed with high severity wildfire to stream ecosystems, and this includes a post-fire pulse of large woody debris, which propagates over decades after the initial fire disturbance. Vegetation and wildlife habitat diversity are commonly increased, and that's associated with the rapid recovery of hardwoods, as we talked about a bit this morning, as well as a regeneration event for conifers, or a sequence of events. And then trophic pulse that Chad also mentioned, that's a productivity pulse that begins in the stream with an increase in light and nutrients to the stream system that propagates up through the stream ecosystem, and then it's often some of that energy actually enters the the terrestrial ecosystem through bird predation, spider predation, et cetera, on stream, on aquatic insects and other secondary production that originates in the stream. But this trophic pulse has been tracked subsequent to fires well into the terrestrial ecosystem. And often the habitat changes is associated with post-fire conditions, especially high severity wildfire, favor native species over invasive species. For example, we have some work in Montana indicating brook trout strongly decline post-fire, whereas cutthroat trout tend to, which are co-occurring in the same system and competing for habitat. The cutthroats often do extremely well after fire. And I'm personally familiar with some of the study sites in that work, and that pattern is held up for now 17 years after the fire event. In fact, it's more strongly expressed than it was when the original work was published about 6 years ago. Brook trout are virtually absent in some of the streams that were affected in the Bitterroot fires of 2000 today. So looking at collectively at the Northwest Forest Plan, packfish and infish, which are of current interest among scientists, and scientists had a fair amount to say about how those protective plans and overlays took shape, and now there's certainly efforts on many fronts to spring free of those overlays in the packfish and infish area, and the Northwest Forest Plan has essentially been abandoned in the new round of forest plans. This just briefly reviews, I think, probably what just about everybody in this room knows in terms of those plans and overlays having established a fairly large default corridors along stream systems that are managed extremely conservatively with regard to timber management and other kinds of forest management, with the priority intent being the restoration of aquatic and riparian ecosystems. Recent proposals, including some of the stuff we've been talking about today, involve increasing active management activities within these areas that have been recognized as having a high risk or high probability of cause and effect interactions between what we do on the ground and what happens in stream systems. And we all know about a host of species that are associated with streams and riparian ecosystems, many of which are not in very good shape in terms of their current status. So I'm going to go through some of the functions that riparian forests play that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at what kinds of practices we should implement in that zone. One of these is that's often overlooked in the Pacific Northwest is nutrient retention functions. This is pretty critical with regard, especially with regard to fire, because fire disturbance in upland areas frees up lots of nutrients. Phosphorus is freed up primarily through erosion and soil mobilization processes, but nitrogen, nitrates in soil water is there's a major spike after any kind of vegetative disturbance, and wildfire is one of those. Logging also, whether or not it's to prevent fire or to manage future fire, logging also is associated with these kinds of nutrient spikes. But if you have a very intact riparian forest zone, and this is pretty much a global effect. These data are from global synthesis, particularly the Sweeney and Newbold study published in 2014, gives you some information on the width of the forested buffer strip and the percent of sediment removal on the right-hand side, which is really equivalent to phosphorus concentration. And this left-hand graph is a little off the screen, but this is nitrogen. So you can see with buffer widths, in order to get to exceeding 80%, on average exceeding 80 to 90% removal of the nitrate concentration in soil water that's passing through the riparian zone, you need you're talking about buffer strips of 100 meters, that's 300 feet and greater. Not coincidentally, that's the default buffer width for at least larger fish-bearing streams in fish and packfish areas, as well as the Northwest Forest Plan. So that's one function that's often not thought about. If you take trees out of that zone, that 300 feet closer to the stream, you're essentially punching holes in this nutrient filter. You're creating spots where decaying roots are going to generate nitrogen, but they don't run through the full width of the full span of that filtering zone, so you're going to increase nitrate leakage to the stream system through soil water and hyporheic water in the stream zone. So take a look at some common rationales for thinning and riparian reserves. We've talked a lot about fuels management and fire, influencing fire, including removing ladder fuels, breaking up fuels continuity, and then there's this concept of wicking, that if you have riparian forests that are not managed, that they become fire wicks that spread high severity fire to the surrounding landscape. At least that's a notion that keeps cropping up in many different places, and there are a few anecdotes that kind of seem like maybe that's something like that happened here and there. There's also a list of other objectives in forests. Well, often these either co-occur with fire and fuels objectives, or say on West Side forests, those are the predominant objectives that include density management, basically, to favor certain species or increase growth rates of selected trees. And another one that's probably comes on the table here sometimes is that notion of favoring dry site species to sort of prepare the forest for future climate change. The basic take-home message is that these kinds of active management activities, particularly when they're pursued with mechanized equipment on the ground, sets up a fairly major trade-off between long-term benefits that are postulated with regard to altering fire behavior, for example, versus near certain adverse effects. So if you're disturbing lots of acres of riparian area, you're virtually certain to have some effects like near stream soil disturbance and sediment delivery, depletion of near and medium term recruitment of woody debris. Essentially any removal of woody debris from the streams is going to be expressed as a decline at some future date. You're just reallocating the time at which that debris is recruited to the ecosystem. There's a risk of thermal and microclimate stress from canopy or opening and reduced shade. There's evidence for intensified fire effects with thinning of stands. In numerous cases, we have the systemic impacts of road networks that are required to conduct activities on a broad basis across the watershed. And if you're trying to do the activities in riparian zones, often those are near stream roads that are being operated off of. In some places there are risks of pathogen dispersal associated with activities. I'll talk a bit more about this notion of depletion of diversity by removing green trees and what the potential consequences of that might be. So here's where I'm coming from. We have lots of speculation about what some of these benefits might be to various forest resources, but we have ample and growing information about the list of impacts that stack up with these kinds of practices. One of the important things to consider, this is really more of an issue with density management, but that riparian areas aren't necessarily, or they're certainly a lot less moisture limited than upland sites, so a lot of the benefits of reducing density in riparian areas aren't going to be expressed, or certainly not to the same degree or in the same way that they're expressed in upland ecosystems. So it's very hard to transfer results from experimental studies from upland sites to predict what's going to happen when you do thinning in a riparian zone. Maybe it's a little more applicable to the outer edge of the riparian zone, certainly not to the interior of the riparian zone. Another important thing to keep in mind, and we kind of touched on this morning, but there's a very high diversity, a plethora of different kinds of disturbance processes, many of which operate either exclusively in riparian areas or with particularly high frequency in riparian areas. A lot of these are relatively patchy kinds of disturbances, so they're not creating big changes over large areas all at once. They're creating gaps in riparian forest succession on a scale of acres or a few acres or less than that, smaller than that in some cases. Blowdown's an example, landslides, fluvial erosion, generalized slope erosion on intergorge slopes along streams, and herbivory are all examples. And these are often ongoing and overlapping with each other, essentially riparian forests. So answering the question about what should the ideal riparian forest look like, well, it should look like a disturbance mosaic with the patches originating from multiple different kinds of disturbances with multiple different prior histories prior to this disturbance that create different legacies, and then multiple subsequent trajectories depending on pretty much the overlay of the next disturbance. What's the next disturbance that comes along, and when does it hit? So, yeah, talked about diversity and complex pathways of succession.
I have a question. Is this
Sure.
open-ended question, or how do we do questions here?
So, I was thinking at the end of each presentation.
Okay.
So after Dr. Frizzell's finished, then we would ask questions.
Oh, thank you.
Redundant slide, so I'm going to skip it. And then there's this question, another related question: what happens when fires burn? What happens in terms of the pattern of fire effects in riparian zones, riparian areas? That's also very complicated. The answer to that is also extremely complicated, and it depends on all the things that the vagaries of wildfire depend on in upland forests, plus a bunch of other things, including the effects of topographic variation. The conjunction of the weather conditions and whether topographic variation is going to have a certain kind of effect on a given day when the fire is passing through that particular patch of ground in the stream ecosystem. So there are a few very generalized patterns that have been picked up, but they're generally weak, and there's lots of noise around these relationships. But as a general rule, in most of the studies that have looked at the correspondence between upland fire behavior or fire effects and riparian fire effects, that if you have a large fire, the effects of the behavior of the upland fire has a significant effect on the conditions or the response in the riparian area. We have lots of exceptions to that rule, but that's one of the general phenomena, that it doesn't generally work the other way. Riparian areas don't wake fires into surrounding landscapes, but the condition and the fire behavior in the surrounding landscape can affect how much change happens in the riparian zone and what the fire does when it gets there. I think I just covered this. So one of the consequences of climate change in this regard is that as fires get larger and the patches of high severity may be getting larger in response to longer fire seasons or longer intervals of red flag fire weather, we may be getting to a situation where the fire behavior in the surrounding landscape has more impact on riparian zones than it did previously. And that's a climate-driven thing, that's not a fuels-driven outcome. But it does have implications for managing the landscape as a whole, and whether you should be managing in riparian areas to affect riparian fire or managing upland areas to affect riparian fire. So there's another set of questions that relate to, well, what do we know about effectiveness of thinning? And most of this work, in fact, virtually all of it that's published or that I even know about, is on upland sites. There are some of these studies that have some riparian sites nested within them, but they're not segregated. And so there's really very little quantitative information that's specific to fire treatment or fuels treatments in riparian areas and how they influence fire outcomes. But I would just say that in my own personal experience, and this is reflected in the synthesis studies that have been done, the meta-analyses by the Forest Service and others, that under a large range of typical burning conditions under which most acres burn, there's very ambivalent evidence that thinning or fuels treatments typically applied have much of any impact on
Can you remind me like tomorrow?
Yeah.
Otherwise it's going to go into 10 minutes.
I'll do it next.
on fire outcomes. So, in fact, there are quite a few there are enough examples where the reverse outcome to the desired one, in other words, that fire severity and intensity apparently increased in thin stands, that in some of the national modeling the Forest Service research program has done, they've actually incorporated that probability into their model predictions for effects of fuels treatments on a large scale. So this is not, it's not a good bet to think that by custom managing forest stands, you're going to have a very large influence on fire outcomes across the landscape. At least that's what the data seems to be telling us. Large wood is very critical, of course, and I don't need to go into this much. I think this group understands the importance of at least has been introduced to the idea that large wood plays important roles, both as standing dead large wood and down dead large wood. And one of those roles is influencing stream dynamics and riparian soil and successional conditions in riparian forests. This is just some plotting, one of the plots generated by work by Michael Pollock and Tim Beatty, and it's reflected in, this is actually the Eugene BLM did some modeling of woody debris recruitment in various stand thinning treatments, and stands 30 to 70 years old, so we're talking about mostly second growth clear cuts here, 10 to 60 to 100 trees per acre. But the general outcome is fairly significant depletion of large wood recruitment relative to what would happen if you simply let the stands go through succession without intervention. This also has been proven true with a wide variety of stands, and these are mostly, to be clear, these are west slope stands, mostly in the Coast Range and the Cascades that have been where this modeling work's been done. Michael Pollock has some unpublished work that he and I collaborated on, and he did find that the debris depletion effect, which is quite strong in these moist forests, is dramatically lower. So there's less future debris depletion and more of a compensatory response to thinning on drier ponderosa pine sites. So we have a very dry forest type. The woody debris depletion factor is substantially less than some of the literature reports for the moister forest types. But in riparian areas, that's not the forest type we're talking about. No matter, just about very few places around here are you going to find those drier forest types in a riparian situation other than the outer fringes. So this slide gets to the notion of this diversity question. So and this applies to whether we're trying to fireproof stands to increase the survival of particular trees, of maybe they're big trees, maybe they're trees of a certain favorite species. It also applies to the notion of just density management. But when we select trees in the thinning, basically the underlying principle of any of those silvicultural manipulations is that density is a controlling factor of, that's why we have obviously density targets for thinning prescriptions, right? That density is a factor that's controlling survival and growth of the trees in the stand. And that's a problematic assumption because there's quite a bit of evidence in the stands that I followed that have been thinned, some lodgepole and some on the west side that are mixed conifer forest types, but there's often evidence for there's secondary effects like post-thin blowdown that sometimes we can kind of anticipate and build. We certainly ought to be anticipating, building into our environmental analyses, but those secondary effects certainly influence the outcome in terms of what trees are going to survive the thinning event, and it influences in a way that's largely beyond our ability to control. So we're setting in motion a successional or a disturbance process that's beyond our control by thinning the stand and making the stand more vulnerable to blowdown. And as I mentioned, we're talking in many respects, we're assuming a density Now, some of the fuel stuff is more talking about proximity of trees of different ages or canopy configuration, and that's a bit different than density competition. But in relation to density competition and the notion that if we thin a stand, we'll increase survival or growth of remaining trees, it's problematic because of the well, for one thing, there are genetic differences amongst trees that we can't measure by looking at a tree and picking which one stays and which one goes. And those genetic differences may control the things like the resistance of a tree to subsequent insect attack in ways that we aren't anticipating. In other words, it may not be density that controls insect attack, it's some innate genetic factor in the tree itself and how it responds to insect attack that determines its survival. And we have some evidence accumulating in the literature now that that is a pretty significant issue in many tree species. We also talked a bit today about subsurface water availability, and it's I won't go into the details of this slide other than to say the work that's been done on subsurface soil moisture and water flow in forested environments, in some of it in North America, some of it other places, but the findings are similar, that there's a great deal of complexity in subsurface water availability that's often very difficult to read. You know, we can't tell, just because a tree is in a crowded situation doesn't mean that those trees are in more competition for water than trees that are naturally distributed in a low density situation. So that high density cluster of trees may be occurring there because there's a lot of water availability at that particular site. Sometimes these are related to surface expressions that are obvious, like subsurface flows may concentrate in a depression or wetland area. In some cases, they're just related to subsurface features that are invisible, like clay lenses or bedrock fractures.